Welcome to this spiritual journey through the words of a man who, in the midst of a devastating personal crisis, found his strength and refuge in God. Today we will explore Psalm 3, a song of faith and trust written by King David during one of the darkest times of his life. We will delve into the story behind this psalm and discover the powerful lessons it teaches us about divine protection, prayer, and spiritual victory. Prepare to connect with God's Word in a new way as we reflect on how this message applies to our lives today. To fully understand Psalm 3, we must step back and explore the events that led David to this crisis. In the biblical account, we are introduced to Absalom, one of David's sons, as a charismatic, attractive, and cunning man. In 2 Samuel 14 verse 25, Absalom is described as the most beautiful man in Israel, underscoring his ability to win the favor of the people. However, behind this appearance was a heart full of resentment, fueled by years of unresolved wounds within David's family. Absalom was no ordinary adversary, he was a charismatic and strategic man who managed to win the hearts of the people of Israel. 2 Samuel 15 verse 6 says it, and quotes, "So he did to all the Israelites who came to the king for judgment, and so Absalom stole the hearts of the Israelites." Thinking about it, he was a man whose speech was marked by manipulation, but whose heart was filled with deep-rooted resentment. He presented himself as an accessible leader, capable of solving the Israelites' problems fairly and directly, something that implicitly criticized David's ability to rule. His revolt not only represented a political threat, but also a devastating personal blow to David. As a father, he faced the anguish of seeing his own son rise up against him, which likely led him to reflect on his failures as a leader and as a father. Picture this: you are the king of Israel, chosen by God, a man after his own heart. You have faced giants, won battles, and ruled with justice, but now, the threat comes from within your own home. Psalm 3 is born in a moment of deep betrayal and pain. David was fleeing from his son Absalom, who had rebelled against him to take the throne. This episode or story is recounted in 2 Samuel chapters 15 to 18, where we see David fleeing Jerusalem while his heart is broken by the betrayal of his own son. Now, you may be wondering, why so much rebellion? Where does so much courage come from? Is there something deeper behind this attitude? Allow me to answer these questions. Absalom's rebellion, courage, and political ambition have their origin in deep roots of family conflicts, but not in any type of conflict, but in those marked by unresolved wounds and decisions that left scars on the entire family. Absalom's rebellion did not come out of nowhere. It was the result of a series of tragic events that began with the rape of his sister Tamar by Amnon, another son of David. You can look it up for your own reference in 2 Samuel chapter 13. This act not only devastated Tamar, but also left Absalom furious. David, although angered upon learning of the event, did not take decisive action against Amnon, which likely increased Absalom's frustration and hatred toward his father. Eventually, Absalom took matters into his own hands and murdered Amnon, his own blood brother. Read it in 2 Samuel 12 verses 28 to 29. Now Absalom had given his servants a charge, saying, "Please, look, when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say, smite Amnon, then kill him, and do not be afraid, for I have commanded you. Be strong and courageous." And Absalom's servants did to Amnon as Absalom had commanded them. Then all the king's sons arose, each man mounted his mule, and fled. This act led to his exile for several years, further increasing his resentment towards David, who seemed unable to properly handle the situation. Although David allowed Absalom to return to Jerusalem after a time, their relationship remained strained and distant, with no real reconciliation. You can look it up in 2 Samuel 14 verses 28 to 33 for your own reference. David had made serious mistakes in his life, including his sin with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah, a story told in 2 Samuel chapter 11. The situation was what added to the rebellion of Absalom his son. This situation not only affected Absalom, but his entire family. Like every story of kings and descendants, in the long run this could also involve a fight for the throne over the children that were to be born to Bathsheba. Thinking about it, this story is really a movie for Netflix. Ha ha ha. Although David had received God's forgiveness in 2 Samuel chapter 12 verse 13, it says it like this, "Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, The Lord has also put away your sin, you shall not die." God's mercy extends beyond what man can imagine, but the consequences of his actions continue to affect his family. This historical and emotional context allows us to understand the depth of David's words in Psalm 3. In this moment of crisis, instead of giving in to despair, the king chooses to seek God as his refuge. Absalom's rebellion can be seen as part of those consequences. David was not only facing the betrayal of his son, but also internal doubts about his ability as a father and leader. This emotional and spiritual background explains the depth of David's words in Psalm 3, where he not only cries out to God for protection, but also reaffirms his faith in divine sovereignty. This story challenges us to reflect, where do we turn when life hits us with unexpected betrayals? David shows us that even when we face the consequences of our mistakes, we can find hope and restoration in God. It is a reminder that His grace is greater than any situation we face. In verses 1 to 2 of Psalm 3, David expresses his anguish in a heartbreaking way. The king is in a desperate situation. "O Lord, how many are my adversaries? Many are those who rise up against me. Many are those who say of me, there is no salvation for him in God." The image is clear. David is surrounded by hostile forces, both from his enemies and from those who once supported him. The magnitude of the threat is terrifying. What is even more painful is the spiritual attack he suffers. His enemies not only challenge his political authority, but also question his relationship with God, insinuating that he has no hope of salvation. This attack is especially cruel, as it calls into question not only David's position as king, but the trust of an entire people in their relationship with God. David's enemies claim that there is no salvation for him in God, which reflects profound blasphemy, as they deny the possibility of divine redemption and protection. This attack on David's faith can be compared to what Job experienced, when his friends reproached him that his suffering was the result of a hidden sin, insinuating that God had abandoned him. David's anguish, therefore, is not only physical and political, but is also deeply spiritual. The perception that God has turned away from him is as devastating as the threat of death he faces. It is as if a very close friend of faith were to tell you, God has abandoned you, God does not support you. It is painful, isn't it? In the midst of this chaos, David, however, refuses to succumb to despair. Instead of giving in to despair, he directs his anguish directly to God, showing us a valuable example. He teaches us that we can bring our doubts and despair before the Lord without fear of being rejected. Honesty with God is not an act of lack of faith, but a way of getting closer to Him in our moments of greatest vulnerability. Despite being surrounded by enemies and facing both physical and spiritual threats, David does not allow fear or despair to rob him of hope. In verse 3 of Psalm 3, he boldly declares, "But you, Jehovah, are a shield around me, my glory, and the one who lifts up my head." This declaration of faith is profound. Even though David is in a vulnerable position, his trust is placed not in his own strength, nor in human support, but in divine protection. The image of God as a shield is one of the most powerful metaphors in Scripture. A shield is not just a physical barrier, it is a complete defense, covering all sides, protecting from any attack. This is how David sees God. His shield is a total and constant protection. Furthermore, David refers to God as my glory. This is a profound recognition that his true identity and dignity do not come from his throne or his kingdom, but from his relationship with God. Even when David was being rejected by his people and his kingdom was in ruins, his glory was not dependent on these external circumstances. Instead of focusing on his downfall, David finds his worth in the presence and support of God. This is a vital lesson. Our identity must be based on who we are before God, not on what we possess or how others view us. David also refers to God as the one who lifts up my head. This phrase expresses an act of restoration. In biblical culture, the head symbolized dignity and honor, and lifting up the head was an act of restoration of position or state of mind. David expresses his hope that despite being in a situation of humiliation and persecution, God will restore his dignity and lift him up. This verse challenges our perspective in the midst of adversity. We can see God as our shield, our glory, and the restorer of our hope, even when circumstances hit us hard. In the midst of his suffering, David does not just lament, he prays with faith and confidence. In verse 4 of Psalm 3, it says, "I cried out to the Lord with my voice, and he answered me from his holy mountain." This statement shows not only the sincerity of David's prayer, but also his deep trust in God's answer. Despite the intensity of his suffering and the isolation he may have felt, David knew that God heard his cry. David's prayer is not a desperate request, but an act of faith, because he is convinced that God will answer him. The holy mountain that David refers to is Mount Zion, the place where the Ark of the Covenant was located, a symbol of God's presence. Although David was physically far from that holy place, he knew that prayer could reach God no matter the distance. This is an important reminder for us today. We do not need to be in a specific place for our prayers to be heard. God is close to us, and our prayer, no matter how sincere, always reaches his presence. David also teaches us persistence in prayer. In Psalm 42 verse 11, a clear picture is shown between the past and the future. If God was faithful before, God will continue to be faithful, because he is our only hope. And quotes, "Why are you cast down, O my soul? Why are you disquieted within me? Hope in God, for I will yet give thanks to him, my salvation and my God." This verse reflects David's internal struggle as he faces the scorn of his enemies, who not only attack his life, but also his faith. Despite the anguish, David reminds himself to wait on God, which strengthens his resolve not to give in to the voices that question his relationship with the Lord. Despite the hopelessness of his situation, he does not stop crying out to God. Trust in God's response is not passive, it is an act of trust that is expressed in constant prayer. David's prayer challenges us to be persistent in our communication with God, no matter how difficult the circumstances. As the Apostle Paul reminds us in 1 Thessalonians 5 verse 17, we must pray without ceasing, trusting that God always hears and answers the prayers of his children. David, despite being surrounded by an enemy army and facing relentless persecution, expresses amazing peace in verse 5, "I lay down and slept, and awoke, for the Lord sustained me." This is a statement of complete trust in God's protection. On a physical level, David is in a place of anguish, as his life is at stake. Spiritually, however, he experiences a calm that can only come from a deep faith in God's faithfulness. David's peace does not depend on the absence of danger, but on his certainty that God is sustaining him. It is important to note that David is not experiencing just physical rest, but spiritual rest. In times of great distress, many may feel too overwhelmed to sleep, as their hearts are filled with anxiety. But David, aware that his life is in God's hands, goes to bed with the assurance that his future is not determined by his enemies, but by divine will. This trust in God's provision is what allows him to rest in the midst of the storm. This act of trusting God completely is also an act of obedience. David chooses to rest rather than act on his own, trusting that the Lord will do what is necessary to sustain him. It invites us to reflect, are we willing to rest in the midst of our difficulties, trusting that God sustains us, even when the path is uncertain? This peace, which transcends human understanding, is the testimony of a life that has learned to trust in the sovereignty of God. As David experiences the peace that only God can provide, we also find in verse 6 of Psalm 3 a declaration of courage, "I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people that set themselves against me." This verse not only reflects the absence of fear in David's heart, but also the unshakable certainty that God is with him. Even though David's enemies were numerous, he did not allow the size of the opposing army to diminish his faith or his courage. David was not looking at the magnitude of his problems, but at the power of his God. In this context, David teaches us a valuable lesson about fear. Fear has the ability to paralyze us, to make us feel powerless and vulnerable. However, when we focus on the power of God, fear loses its hold on us. David does not deny the reality of the threat, but his trust in God gives him the courage to face it with hope. In Psalm 27 verse 3, written by David himself, he tells us, "Though an army encamp against me, my heart will not fear, though war rise against me, I will be confident." This verse reaffirms the courage that comes from trusting in God, where even the most threatening circumstances cannot steal our peace or confidence. This courage is not something that David has achieved by his own strength. Rather, it comes from faith in divine protection. David knows that, even if he is surrounded by an army, God is his defender. This security allows him to act with determination, without being discouraged by fear. In this way, David's courage becomes an example for us. In our own moments of adversity, we must remember that our strength does not come from our abilities, but from the presence of God in our lives. In verse 7 of Psalm 3, David cries out in faith to God, "Arise, O Lord, save me, O God, for you have struck all my enemies on the cheek, the teeth of the wicked you have broken." Despite his complete trust in God's protection, David does not remain passive in the face of the threat. He prays and asks for God's direct intervention. This is a clear example of how faith does not exclude action, but is expressed in fervent prayer. David cries out to God urgently, asking him to intervene decisively. In his words, there is a deep trust that God will not only hear his cry, but will act. David's request is not a timid or doubtful prayer, but a bold declaration that God has the power to defeat his enemies. The image of God striking David's enemies and breaking their teeth is symbolic of the total and humiliating defeat of those who oppose the divine will. David has complete confidence that when God intervenes, the enemies are defeated. This verse also shows David's trust in divine justice. Although he is being unjustly persecuted, he does not take revenge on his own. Instead of seeking his own righteousness, David turns to God, trusting that he is the righteous judge who will deal with the wicked. This challenges us, too, to trust in God's righteousness and let him deal with those who harm us. David concludes Psalm 3 with a declaration of confidence that victory does not depend on him or his strength, but on divine intervention. Let us read verse 8, "Salvation is from the Lord, your blessing be upon your people." Throughout this psalm, David has spoken of his difficulties and how he has faced adversity with trust in God. However, in this final verse, David recognizes that true victory does not come from his efforts, nor from his strategies, but only from God. Salvation belongs to the Lord, and it is he who grants blessing to his people. David takes no credit for victory. This statement reflects an attitude of humility and recognition that everything he possesses, even his victory, is a gift from God. In a broader context, this is an important lesson. When we experience victories in our lives, we must remember that they come from God. He is the giver of all good, and any triumph or blessing we receive is only by his grace. David's victory was not the result of his skill as a warrior, but of divine intervention that sustained him in the process. Furthermore, this verse also contains a blessing toward God's people. Not only does David benefit from God's salvation, but this blessing extends to all who belong to the Lord's people. The victory of one becomes the victory of all, because God's salvation is collective and shared with those who align themselves with his will. This verse challenges us to live with gratitude, knowing that the salvation and blessings we experience come from his love and mercy, and that we are to share those blessings with others. Throughout this psalm, David has modeled an exemplary response to distress. In verses 5 through 7, we see a sequence of actions that teach us how we can respond to our own difficulties with faith and confidence. As enemies rise up against him, David does not fall into panic or despair. Instead, he seeks God's presence, prays fervently, and trusts that divine intervention will be his rescue. David begins with a peace that can only come from God, sleeping peacefully, knowing that the Lord sustains him in verse 5. He then faces adversity with courage, assuring that he will not fear even thousands of enemies in verse 6. Finally, David offers an urgent prayer for God's intervention to destroy his enemies in verse 7. These three steps, peace, courage, and prayer, are a practical guide for anyone facing times of trial. The act of sleeping peacefully, as mentioned in verse 5, is a testimony that David's faith does not depend on the absence of problems, but on his trust in the Lord. He knows that even though the battle is great, his life is safe in God's hands. In this sense, the peace David experiences is an act of surrender. He submits to God's will and rests in his sovereignty. David's courage in verse 6 demonstrates that trust in God is not passivity. Active faith gives us the courage to face any situation. And finally, the prayer in verse 7 shows that faith does not just remain in the emotional or intellectual realm, it translates into action, specifically the action of crying out to God for help. Finally, Psalm 3 reminds us of the importance of recognizing God's sovereignty in all circumstances. David, after having expressed his trust and faith in divine intervention, concludes the psalm with a reminder that salvation is from the Lord, salvation is from the Lord, your blessing be upon your people. This recognition of God's sovereignty is a recurring theme in the Psalms, as we are constantly reminded that all we are and all we have depends on Him. Recognizing that salvation comes from God leads us to a life of humility. It invites us to live with an attitude of gratitude, knowing that nothing we have is by our own merit, but by the grace and mercy of God. Salvation, in all its aspects, from spiritual salvation to protection in our daily struggles, is a gift from God that we cannot earn by our own strength. This verse also calls us to extend our trust to all aspects of our lives. If we understand that salvation and blessing come from God, we must submit to His will in all areas of our lives, seeking to live according to His purpose and not according to our own desires. Almost concluding this study, Psalm 3, in its entirety, offers us a powerful testimony of faith, courage, and trust in divine intervention. Through the verses, David shows us how to face adversity with an attitude of complete dependence on God. Despite the serious threats he faced, he did not give in to fear or despair, but found in his relationship with the Lord the peace and courage necessary to move forward. From the beginning of the psalm, where he expresses his anguish, to the end, where he recognizes that salvation and victory belong to God, David offers a clear example of how we should respond when we face difficulties. Faith in God's sovereignty, the peace that only He can provide, and the courage to face our fears are key elements that make the difference between despair and hope. This psalm invites us to reflect on our own lives and how we respond to trials. Do we trust in God as our protector and shield? Are we willing to rest in His sovereignty, pray with faith, and act with courage, knowing that our victory depends entirely on Him? In the midst of our struggles, David's example challenges us to look beyond our circumstances and recognize that salvation and blessings always come from God, who is faithful to sustain His people. Leave us your answer in the comments. I will not say goodbye to this video without first saying, an echo of faith, a promise of peace, may the Psalms illuminate your path, and the blessing of God fill your life. If you liked our video, give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Activate the bell so that you receive the notification when I upload a new video. God bless you.